Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 300 of CryptoBiography. Wow, we've made it to 300, and it is part 7 of the brick wall. I'm really happy that we're at 300. I was thinking for a while that I would do like something different for 300, but I'm really liking this story, so I just wrote it this week, and despite the fact that it was a rather busy week for me. And yeah, so we're on we go. So if you recall, Carson was about to have his first match, a sparring match, but still a match. And that's about to happen right now. Here we go. His gloves were on, and he was as ready as he could be. "Evening, everyone," Bill said in his rasp, and the crowd buzzed in appreciation. "Tonight we're happy to be having a sparring match, and not only that, the first sparring match for two up-and-coming heavyweights." He ended the sentence with gusto, and the crowd cheered its approval. Bill turned to Carson, looking directly in the eyes and making a small gesture that he should climb into the ring. "First, hailing from the western New York State, Carson, the Brick Wall Brax." Carson stepped through the ropes and raised his gloves in the air. There was a polite buzz. On some level, he could tell already he wasn't this crowd's favorite. He could hear, just barely, Lydia whooping her enthusiasm. But the excitement had his head buzzing, and the whole situation took on a sort of underwater, dreamy quality. He could barely hear anything. Across the ring, Tommy Dawson was now climbing into the ring. He supposed the crowd was being louder for the Southside Slammer as he was being introduced, but he couldn't hear. His ears were actually ringing with the excitement of the moment. On some level, he supposed he should be afraid, but he wasn't. He was simply experiencing a sort of high, a little like before a big football game, but much more intense. Bill brought them to the center of the ring and explained the rules, though Carson couldn't hear or understand them. They'd prepared for this moment, so he knew what Bill would be saying, but he might have been speaking Greek for all he could understand. Tommy and he touched gloves and went to their corners. Carson heard the bell, and Tommy charged forward. Carson stepped forward himself, putting his gloves up high so he was just looking over the tops of them as Bill had drilled into him. He wasn't even sure he could really hit Tommy, not for real. Tommy hadn't done anything to him. That was the last thought he had before Tommy brought his left fist around for a hook shot on the right side of his face. The fuzzy world instantly went to a glass-like clarity. Some feral instinct took over. He immediately jabbed out once, twice, hitting his gloves only. He slipped to the right and kept striking, but mostly found Tommy's gloves. He tried a left jab, followed by a right to the body, but the right, too, got deflected by Tommy's forearm. Meanwhile, Tommy was popping out jabs and hits back at Carson. He could tell most of them were impacting only on his defensive frame, absorbed by his gloves or forearms. His newfound clarity gave him thinking room. He tried hooks, straight shots, jabs. He was moving, mostly to the right, looking for an opening. He was taller than Tommy, but Tommy was extremely strong. Still, he had range and was punching downward slightly. But since this was a sparring match, it was only going 5 rounds, which was Jake's policy. He did a heavy, probing jab when Tommy's gloves dropped a couple of inches. Tommy recovered in time, so the punch didn't hit square, but with his face covered, Carson threw a heavy right to the belly. This one connected, and Tommy took a step back. He wasn't exactly staggered, but it was the first time Carson had seen one of his punches have an effect on the heavily browed Tommy. Tommy became visibly angry, almost snarling at Carson. He threw some wild punches, which Carson blocked easily, as they were all aimed at his head. He took a quick look between his gloves, and yet another punch grazed his ear. Now he knew where Tommy's fists were, so he ducked under the fist that had been on his ear, and while he twisted his body, he brought his fist against Tommy's ribs. Tommy grunted and stepped back. Carson stepped forward, intending to take advantage, but the bell rang. Bill oriented him towards his corner. That seemed very fast. Carson could hardly believe that 2 minutes had passed. Still, he was sweating as he hadn't ever sweated before. There was a tall tin cup of water tucked behind the corner post for him. He drank some and poured some over his head, feeling it trickle down his face, then down his back as he rolled his head back. Before he knew it, the bell for round 2 was ringing. Both of them were wound up, and it was as if the bell had launched them at each other. Tommy was punching wildly, hoping to get around Carson's defenses. Carson was giving as well as getting, defending well, but popping out with jabs and short cross combinations. Some were landing for both of them, but Carson hardly felt them, and from the looks of things, Tommy didn't either. Carson slipped to the right again when he felt a punch pop off of his left shoulder, then did a flurry of punches at Tommy's face. Once he saw his gloves come up, he went to the stomach and landed several good hits there. They went back and forth like that for some time. Towards the end of the round, Carson made a mistake. He put his feet down wrong and was briefly out of control of his balance. Tommy popped him square on the forehead. Carson took a step back, a little dazed, but not hurt. He punched back, and Tommy had been trying for a second punch. Tommy's second punch grazed his cheek, but he hit Tommy on the ear. Tommy then had to take a step back himself. Carson followed, but Tommy was ready this time and slipped Carson's jab and gave him a solid hit on his cheek. The bell rang again. They returned to their corners, and Carson took a bit more water and doused himself. He was aware on some level that his arms were aching, but his mind was too abuzz to pay it much mind. He was purposely not looking at the crowd. He didn't want to see Lydia, didn't want to see her horrified, or even excited. He didn't want to make her feel like she had to put up a brave front for him, so instead he looked into the dark corners of the gym. Before he knew it, the bell for round 3 rang. Both fighters were more winded now, but they still rolled at each other. This time, Tommy seemed to want Carson to take the first shot. He obliged him, giving a couple of quick left jabs, but holding back on the right cross. He wanted to see how he would react. Tommy kept his guard up, then threw a right at Carson. It was partly deflected by his glove, but still popped him on his temple. Carson shook it off and threw a right jab, followed by a big punch low, but Tommy dodged it. Carson forced him to keep moving back by throwing more jabs, all up high, watching for counters. Tommy reached the ropes. He was more or less in the middle, so Carson stepped left and tried to force him toward the corner. Tommy realized the problem, but when he had stepped towards the middle of the ring, Carson hit him with a right. Carson realized that Tommy was winded. He too was tired, but Tommy was no longer in a position to stop him from putting him where he wanted. He stepped forward, popped a jab against Tommy's gloves to force him to defend himself, then came in with a hook shot. It hit solidly against the side of Tommy's head. Tommy staggered and fell back, then landed hard in a sitting position near the corner of the ring. His arms were held up by the lowest rope. Bill waved Carson off, then started to count, but Tommy was clearly not trying to get up. "Winner!" yelled Bill, and the crowd roared. And that's the end of this episode for this week, but it's not the end of the story. Plenty more fighting that Carson has to do in this story, in this tale, and lots of other things going on too. But it was fun to write the entirety of the first fight this week. So hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, or Mastodon. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2023 CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictionalized, or satirical.